Hello, everybody. I feel so tall. Welcome to the Dogtown Writers Festival, its opening evening, and the Joseph E. Garland keynote address. This festival has been lovingly planned and organized by the Gloucester Writers Center, so a big thank you to all of them. And it's very inspiring to see all of you here. My name is Alison Carlson. I am the daughter of the Keynote honoree's wife, Helen Garland, who, with her late husband, Joe, provided support that has helped make the Writers Center and this festival possible. I am a sister of the Essex-based author Janet Carlson, who serves on the Writers Center board. And my third real claim to fame is that I'm a stepdaughter of Gloucester's late great historian and writer, civic activist, commentator, mentor, sartorially somewhat challenged harmonica-playing sailor, and all-around DIY fix-it guy, Joe Garland, in whose name tonight's address, So, of course, I'm really pleased to be here, and I wasn't going to say this, but I think I need the workshop on silencing your inner critic tomorrow, because I do have to write for work a fair bit, and I hate it. It's excruciating for me. I clean every closet before I have to write something. So I told Joe that I thought people who love to write are sick in the head. In any case, I should kick off the evening by actually saying that Joe would be beaming. He would be ecstatic, were he alive now, to see this festival happening and to see what the Writers Center has become. But Joe is here with us in spirit in so many ways, and through many of you. How he loved writing and writers, how he loved Gloucester, Cape Ann, and the whole of New England, all of its lore, its surrounding seas and iconic sailing vessels, from which he drew genuine inspiration and energy. And how he adored my mother, his partner in mischief and joy, pride, and for those of you who knew him, shall we say, a healthy dose of pretty well-considered but steady outrage. Joe was ever so passionate about history and current affairs, sharing his views by his newspaper columns, passionate too about art in many forms and the broadest of senses, and about this region's artists in particular. To his mind, I think you people of his beloved Cape Ann were, well, still are, artists in one form or another, in one shape or another, from fisher folk to boat builders, to musicians, painters, filmmakers, and writers, to just plain creative individuals in uncommon community. That's what I tell people in California, where I live, when I try to explain this place. It is chock full of characters, wild, woolly, accomplished, interesting, and unusual, all of whom and which Joe couldn't wait to get up to his harbor and sea view study to record. What I think he engendered most is a sense of place, pride in and love of place, building community and appreciation for what is special and worth preserving. He did it through the many forms of his writing, his speaking and civic engagement. He did it through his exhortation to fellow citizens to unite for your country's good. An obvious example would be that with others, he masterminded bringing the famed schooner Adventure back to Gloucester. Or his last column, in which he urged Gloucester's citizens to unite against those who would use Gloucester for their own self-interested ends. Some of you are his mentees, as I was when I first started writing and commentating for public radio. And I will adore him forever for the brilliant, generous-hearted encouragement and guidance that he gave me, among many others during his 89 years. Joe would be elated that his widow has spent her years since his death, around this time in 2011, carrying on his legacy. Helen, Mom, would you stand up for a second and just wave? Or just wave if you don't want to stand up. She was a champion for our environment and planet, around the UN mostly, when more than 40 years ago, she moved here from New York and married Joe. And I know that she now feels as attached to this community and its environs as much as Joe ever did. And I'm really proud of her for caring so much about what happens here, around here, and to you and to your commonwealth. Democracy, history, community, environment. Throughout his life, Joe advocated for a fully engaged citizenry to preserve the city's integrity, its authenticity, and transparency as a democratic, participatory community. Joe and Helen recognized that the very fabric of Gloucester's cultural identity was at risk of dissolution in the face of these larger kind of industrial shifts that are fundamentally changing our nation's and this region's socio-economic landscape. Joe's impassioned writing served as a community conscience, prodding citizen involvement in preserving Gloucester's history and heritage. It's from this that Helen's Garland Legacy Project arose, to ensure that Joe's central values would continue to inspire and guide key endeavors that were dear to him. The GLP honored Gloucester's history, culture, and natural environment by providing support of over $100,000 across 2018 and 2019 to a handful of innovative local programs that advance citizen self-government, the governance, historic awareness of place and purpose, especially as the city approaches its 400th anniversary in 2023. Leadership in environment and ocean stewardship and preservation of the commons, the opportunity and grace of the written word and literary arts, an understanding of PTSD, the trauma of war, and importance of pursuing peace. The Legacy Project now strives in kind to ensure that these defining values remain vibrant and relevant, serving to promote a just, compassionate society, a transparent, accountable government, and regenerative natural and planetary systems. I know that this is aligned with the purpose and efforts of others among you here tonight, and you are about to hear from a couple of them, one of whom, this evening's Master of Ceremonies, in fact, promotes sense of place through his acclaimed photojournalism and filmmaking. For the past 40 years, Nubar Alexanian has worked for magazines in the United States and Europe, including Life, the New York Times, Time, Fortune, Newsweek, and more, National Geographic. He has produced and directed both long and short form video for companies and nonprofits, and he has 6 books in print, including Jazz with Wynton Marsalis. Since 2011, he's been working on a feature documentary with his daughter, Abby, who could not be here tonight because she has strep throat, But this deals with the powerful legacy of the Armenian genocide and how centuries of silence about that and denial has shaped his family. And Nubar and his Walker Creek Media colleagues have just released a 7-minute film about how climate change is affecting where you live and where you work, with consequences that stretch from Nova Scotia down the coast to Rhode Island and beyond. It's called Recipe for Disaster: Green Crabs in the Great Marsh, which you can find at walkercreekmedia.com. So, Mr. MC Nubar, I pass the festival baton to you.
Thank you, Alison. Can you, what's that? I'm using this? Okay. I have another mic here, though. Oh, so good evening, and thank you for all coming tonight. To the mic. Okay, right there? I have another mic on, though, right here, you know. No, it's not working. Okay. So, again, thank you, Alison. That was wonderful. And good evening, and thank you all for coming tonight, for being part of the Dogtown Writers Festival. This wonderful event with writers from near and far gathering here in the same place at the same time to discuss how a sense of place can influence writing. I just think it's an amazing idea. Before we begin, the Gloucester Writers Festival, the Gloucester Writers Center would like to thank the Garland Legacy Project and the Mass Cultural Council and the Awesome Gloucester for making this possible, and the 1623 studios who are here documenting it. The Dogtown Writers Festival Committee has worked hard for 2 years to make this happen. Thanks to Dan Duffy, Sandra Williams, Cindy Szymanski, Mary Ellen Lepionka, and our amazing media event consultant, Stacy Dexter, back there. Thank you also to the wonderful volunteers. I mean, really, events like this take a village, and there are tons of volunteers who are in your program. You can see their names there. It's a special night here to be in City Hall with all of you, and grateful to In the Dark Professional Sound for helping us out tonight. This is a difficult place. So, I'm going to introduce to you Willa Brosnihan. Willa, are you here? Are you there? Excellent. Willa Brosnihan wrote her first poems for an assignment in grade school. In first or second grade, she remembers reciting them aloud for her grandmother so she could transcribe them in legible handwriting. Today, Willa is a high school student and staff writer for Gloucester High School's newspaper, The Gillnetter, and the co-editor of the school's literary magazine, The Elicitor. She has placed in the top 3 of her category in Sawyer Free Library's Poetry Without Paper contest for 6 consecutive years, winning first place 4 times. She has received Golden Key and Silver Key awards from the Boston Globe, Scholastic, and Writing Arts Awards, and so much more. Please join me in welcoming Willa Brosnihan.
Hi. So I'm reading a poem about place, just to go with our theme tonight. This is a poem I wrote on 10 Pound Island, and it is called Dying for the Shack on 10 Pound Island. Our carving was in a way from the edge of the island, coated in seaweed wool, algaeous orange, brown, and black, and the remnants of seagulls, their feathers, their droppings, crab backs, a whole splayed wing. Living ones stood on rocks in pairs. They have different voices, the seagulls. Sometimes they take turns. Lila and I battered the flowering pricker field with a glass bottle that had been for so long an ornament beneath it. And all was not quite well, but it cannot always be the time to ask ourselves for comfort. The path had been taken so fully that I lost all belief in paths. Before we had put our bodies in the trees, we had been so naked and hadn't known. I had pointed to sets of gulls on high rock, said, "Look how noble," laughed at the way they bulged to the wind. The prickers carved me, only shallow, stinging strokes, but carved and made me feel like one of the ones that survived. Told Lila this in my blush of tearing. I tore at those vines like a bear on a pilgrimage. Told her with delicate pink lines sliced high as my bare hip. I did all this in a bikini, and I was already a casualty to the end when I told her. Scavenged by the healthy island birds, scavenged to bone, under the tiny, unkind roses, bindweed on my unchewables. Told her I survived. We came out again with a rusty saw, made the clearing faster. Don't know where Lila left it when we were done. Threw it back to the shack where it had been left before maybe, under a tree maybe, in one of the nostril crevices between the rocks. All I know is that when we returned to the edge of the island, the painter was still there where we left him, stepping back from his easel and to it again, like painting was kissing. Stepped perilously backward from it, across the slippery, across the barnacled, to hold the boat-pocked face in his hand because, so beautiful, he couldn't keep from seeing it for so long. Needed to swallow his lips in order to see her without doubled eyes. When the cloud cover of the morning cleared to muted blue, the scrapes on my legs exerted themselves, drugged up on salt. Painter took off his shirt, rolled it in a ball, and suddenly with the sun, too many colors, too many to bear. Thank you.
Thank you, Willa. We look forward to hearing much more from you in the future. We'd like to take a moment here to invite everybody to stop by the GWC table to learn ways to donate and become involved with the Gloucester Writers Center. Cape Ann is a community that supports each other. We especially want to thank the Cape Ann Museum, the Garland House, North Shore Art Association, Ocean Alliance, the Sargent House Museum, and the T.S. Eliot House for hosting tomorrow's workshops and panels. We'll be talking a bit about that. It's now my pleasure for the introduction of my friend Sandy Tolan. Cell phones, please. No, I'm joking. So a photojournalist friend of mine was giving a presentation of his work to a group of young photographers. And someone asked him the following question. I'm too loud. No, it's good. That's good? Okay. A photojournalist friend of mine was giving a presentation of his work to a group of young photographers, and someone asked him the following question. Where does art come into what you do? His answer was 9th, after car rentals. It was a clever answer, and everybody laughed. But it was also an important answer because it speaks to the demanding skills necessary to be a journalist. For a magazine journalist, what comes before car rentals is being an attentive observer, an exacting researcher, a persuasive interviewer, and a fantastic storyteller and writer, and the ability to become a local in a new location just when you hit the ground. I met Sandy Tolan in 1989 in Tucson, Arizona. We were on assignment for the New York Times Magazine to do a story along the Mexican border. Now, the working relationship between a photojournalist and a writer can be a crapshoot. You just never know, and it just occurred to me, neither do they. Most writers I've worked with are understandably literal, which is obviously fine, as long as it doesn't trickle into what I'm doing as a photographer, which is more metaphor and less narrative. After checking into my hotel, Sandy pulled up in an old red Renault Le Car. I don't even remember what that. He jumped out of the car wearing a button-down plaid shirt, blue jeans, dusty cowboy boots, and greeted me with a full smile. Everything was going to be just fine. Sandy and I worked beautifully together and became fast friends. We remain close to this day, both personally and professionally, giving each other honest feedback about our work, an active witness that is so important for all of us who are working creatively. Sandy is a best-selling author and award-winning radio and print journalist who reports on and comments frequently about Palestine and Israel. He is a professor at the USC's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism in Los Angeles. He's an amazing reporter, truly, gathers facts endlessly and follows these facts as they help build the arc of the story he's telling. Sandy is relentless, uncompromising, curious, compassionate, and above all, he's fair. He has a unique and exceptional voice, both in radio and print, and is a great teacher. He has 3 books in print, including The Lemon Tree, An Arab, a Jew, in the Heart of the Middle East, which is an exploration of the lives of a Palestinian and an Israeli who lived in the same house before and after 1948. Sandy is a co-founder of Homelands Productions, which for 25 years has produced international documentary and features for public radio. In 1990, he and his 3 colleagues, which includes our close friend and writer Alan Weissman, who's with us tonight and is also part of this festival, they proposed a radio series called Vanishing Homelands that would chronicle the loss of land and culture across Latin America and the Caribbean in the 500 years since the arrival of Columbus. They wrote the grant proposal, but were turned down by foundation after foundation, 29 times. Sandy told me he resubmitted the proposal a second time to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, just to make the number of rejections a round number, 30. Excuse me. But this time they got the grant, which was enough money to send 4 journalists on a 2-year odyssey to produce 7 hours of public radio documentaries from 14 countries. During his Neiman year at Harvard in 1993, he visited Gloucester many times, and he eventually moved here. Not only did he become a local when he hit the ground, he lived and worked here for 10 years, and besides establishing a deep relationship with Joe Garland, produced a beautiful and compelling radio series called Gloucester at the Crossroads that aired on Living on Earth, which was then an NPR program. These stories were not only a window into our world for a national audience, but a mirror for all of us who live here as well. Please join me in welcoming Sandy Tolan.
Wow. Nubar. I don't know what to say. Man, it's so great to be seeing so many people I know and love, and I feel so lucky that I have, this place is a home place for me. No matter how long I'm gone, I'm back, and it's like I'm home, and I'm so grateful for that, and grateful to the Gloucester Writers Center for inviting me, allowing me to talk to Helen, to remember Joe with a lot of sweetness and some sadness that he's gone. We could use his voice now. And I just want to repeat some of the thanks to Annie, Stacy, Sandra, Henry Farini, Alison and Helen, and just being here is really such a pleasure. It's so good to be here. So I'm going to talk about Joe for a while, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of the memories. I first met Joe probably in the mid-1990s, not long after I moved to Gloucester. For the past 2 years, as Nubar was just telling you, I've been traveling the world with 3 other journalists, Alan Wiseman, Cecilia Weissman, our late wonderful colleague, Nancy Postero, for a series called Vanishing Homelands. And among the things we documented were the threats to survival of entire cultures around Latin America, and telling the stories of resilience, people fighting to keep their identity, their livelihood in the places where they lived. For example, the Kuna Indians in Panama facing massive settler colonization and projects alongside big hydropower dams. In Honduras, artisanal fishermen, protectors of the delicate and threatened mangrove forests, pushed out so that Honduran generals could cash in on shrimp exports to the US. In Ecuador, where networks of oil roads and pipelines forced thousands of Kofan people to flee as young people learned the name of a country they lived in. I met a guy my age who was 14 when he learned that he lived in a country called Ecuador, and that was when these big, really loud birds came, and they were actually helicopters. And I remember sitting in a hut with him talking about this. We were the same age, such different backgrounds. In the Dominican Republic, where children were kidnapped and forced to work the brutal conditions of the sugarcane fields. And in Bolivia, where indigenous people emerged from centuries of nomadic life into the hands of Christian missionaries. And so we produced these 7 hours for NPR, and not so long after that, I landed in Gloucester, and I saw my first St. Peter's Fiesta. And that Friday night, that first St. Peter's Fiesta, I don't know, maybe 94, 95, I remember that parade on that Friday night, the solemn parade, maybe it was a Thursday, and somebody might correct me here. The parade of the faithful, the statue of St. Peter wobbling on its platform, the cupped hands protecting the candles from the evening breeze as they walk towards the replica of the Basilica, which for most of the year, of course, is a parking lot, right? And I thought to myself, wait a minute. I don't have to travel halfway around the world to tell a story about a place where people are fighting to preserve, to survive, to assert who they are. Strangely, my new home felt so familiar to where I had been for the past few years in some very deep ways. And it led me to start thinking about Gloucester as a place of similar cultural crossroads. And I thought, well, what if I tried to tell some of the story of Gloucester and what it was facing at the time? And as soon as I spoke that thought out loud, people quickly started telling me, if you're going to do anything about Gloucester, man, you got to go see Joe Garland. I'm like, go see who? Joe Garland. You got to go see Joe Garland. Okay, Joe Garland. I go see Joe Garland. And I knew a little history, not much, but a little bit of the writerly people here, Olson, Farini, and now Garland. I had to go see Garland. That old journalist turned author and historian. Over 4 decades, I quickly learned to that point, he'd written more than a dozen books about the maritime history of this place, as Alison was telling us. And anyway, so I called him up. And he said, go read, before you come see me, go read Down to the Sea. Actually, he said, go read Down to the Sea. The story about centuries of loss of the Gloucestermen in the North Atlantic. So I did. And then I went out there to Black Bess, as Joe and Helen call their home out at Eastern Point. And who arrives at the front door but this crooked-smiled, slightly bent, white-haired man, jeans and a blue denim shirt, always a blue denim shirt, under that shock of white hair and those clear, probing blue eyes, sparkling. This is the man who meets me at the driveway and leads me inside. And as you approach, those of you who have been out there, first thing is the sound of the ticking clocks. And dozens of ticking grandfather clocks. And then, man, through the giant picture windows, the panorama, I mean, talk about place. Spires of Gloucester on our right, the path to the open sea before us, the sweep from the inner harbor to the outer harbor, and out beyond the breakwater, down to the sea. And we sat down, the old journalist and the younger one, and kind of got right into it. And it wasn't long before he was quoting scripture, specifically Psalm 107, from where Joe got the title of his book.
They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth, and raiseth the stormy wind.
Now, Joe wasn't just any ordinary historian drawn to the maritime legacy of an old storied fishing town. He was that, but he wasn't just that. First of all, he was the third generation of Joseph E. Garlands, the son and grandson of two Dr. Joseph E. Garlands. His father was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. You might ask, why would a man like this come to the edge of the sea and tell the story of the oldest non-native fishing community in what would become the United States after 1623? Sure, he was driven by curiosity, drawn here by the layers of history that would attract many journalists and writers to a place such as Gloucester. But there was something deeper. For Joe, there was also a darker legacy. Joe had been on the Anzio beachhead in Italy in World War II. Trench warfare that seemed to soldiers more like World War I, fighting over inches of territory. And Joe came back with that. Back then they called it shell shock. Between World War I and World War II it changed. Still called it shell shock. And he'd seen men die. Today we'd call it PTSD. Something deep connected him to Gloucester from that experience, he told me. Risk, peril, loss. The estimated 10,000 Gloucestermen who had gone down to the sea. That's one fisherman every 14 days for 396 years up to now. Joe felt it was like war.
I immediately felt a kind of a kinship with the fishermen that evoked the sort of kinship that I had had as a soldier with my buddies. And there was nothing that I had ever encountered or seen in ordinary life that was comparable to it until I just sort of discovered what these guys had been going through in Gloucester. So I felt a strange kind of brotherhood.
That was from that first conversation, that first day that we met. We talked a lot about the legacy of loss, of telling stories of loss. And Joe told me how he had dug up old records, long-lost diaries, fishing reports, newspaper clippings, chronicling the life here and counting up that loss. Nearly 4,000 in one 60-year stretch in the 1800s, when the schooners were built more for speed than for safety. He read from one 1887 account in the wake of a storm, 136 winters past. It said, a single storm on the night of February 24th, 1862, 15 Gloucester vessels and 120 men were lost, leaving 70 widows and 140 fatherless children to mourn for the loved ones who would return no more. And then he read from an account from another storm 17 years later.
1879. A cloud of sorrow hangs over our city. 14 of the fishing fleet with their precious lives remain unaccounted for since the gale of February 20th. Eyes are watching for the return of the absent Georgesmen. There are sad forebodings as the hours glide by, which only God and aching hearts will ever know of. It is terrible. The very thought of the probable loss which o'ershadows this community is well nigh overwhelming, and it is the theme on every tongue, the all-engrossing thought of our people. It's a sad thing. The American dream has always been that joy and discovery and energy and activism and optimism are what have knit our society together and have brought it power and expansion and so on. But I reckon that in a more profound way, loss is a more enduring kind of social cement.
Think about that. Loss as an enduring social cement, a powerful binding agent that perhaps more than celebration and joy even brings us together. And what better proof do we have than this gathering right now, right here tonight? We celebrate Joe, obviously we do, but of course we still mourn the loss of Joe. And we're here together doing that, bound by as much as anything by loss, by our enduring social cement. And what exactly have we lost with the passing of Joe Garland? Man, a lot of things. Maybe most centrally, he told the story of this place, as Alison was telling us. I was looking through his column. He had two wonderful collections of columns, if you haven't seen them. Second one is called Beam Reach, his columns from the Gloucester Daily Times. Joe wrote of schooners and trawlers, vessels hauling shrimp and lobster, and even huge blocks of granite, of Englishmen and Newfoundlanders, Irish and Portuguese and Sicilians, even Maltese, of their stories, of weirs and traps and draggers, cod and herring, mackerel and tuna, of an inner harbor half solid with ice one winter. And Joe told the stories of the Great Fire of 1864, the filming of a 13-part silent serial called Bride 13. Who knew that? The story of a man named James Mary and a Spanish bullfighting bull in Dogtown Common, for which this Writers' Festival is named. Not the bull, but the Dogtown. Of fog and mud and wet socks, of hollyhocks and squash and a 7-foot foxglove. There's a picture in Beam Reach of Alison and Joe with this 7-foot foxglove. He even wrote a column on how literally Gloucester got to be so salty. Go and read it. Get Beam Reach and read it. And then, of course, there was the stuff that just stops you. Here's Joe on Memorial Day 1988, a column called The Gardens of Our Souls. Faith, the immortal soul, faith in humanity, in our own humanity, in the soil from which we arose and to which we will return, in the rectifying and restorative order of the universe, faith in the search for the right. I mean, what a gift. What a gift he gave us, so many gifts. From these writings, we can understand that with Joe Garland, it wasn't only about documenting loss at sea or of recounting the days on the high seas or the tales of the Revolutionary War before that in Guns Off Gloucester, or even the astonishing adventure of a lone voyager named Howard Blackburn. It wasn't just about chronicling the legacy of a place that quite literally through that harbor is connected to the world. For Joe, it was also about connecting that great span of history to the present, telling the whole story as much as he could of this magnificent place, invoking the past and tying it, bringing it into the present. Like Charles Olson, like Vincent Farini, he was a voice for the town, a conscience of Gloucester, as Alison mentioned. For me, so much about Joe is about fighting for this place and what it means. Joe was a fighter, and he was an honest witness to the times he lived in. He was such a big defender of keeping the harbor zoned for maritime use back in those fights during those days in the late 90s and before and after that too. I'll never forget his passion, his voice in defense of that, especially in the fight over the proposed harbor rezoning for the paint factory. I was just talking with someone before the evening began about the paint factory. Even then, as the fishing stocks were plummeting. And there, as fishing declined, Joe Garland was the man unafraid to sound the alarm. Now, around the globe, we face the bitter bounty of our greed, wharf-bound vessels and hundreds of thousands of fishing people on the beach, he wrote in 1997, 22 years ago. Unrestrained mechanical power has destroyed the balance. The fisherman toils only to reap, never to sow, he wrote. But he placed the blame more on the rogue wave of exploitation of the horizon-to-horizon foreign factory fleets that blitzed George's Bank, vessels wreaking destruction on home grounds already critically depleted. And what would Joe say now, 22 years later? with a fishing fleet now at a couple dozen by some counts, shrunk from perhaps 300 in the so-called heyday of the 1980s, and many more than that in this list of vessels from 1892, 40 alone that started with the letter A, the Abbey Dodge, the Abbott Coffin, the Aberdeen, the AC Newhall, Active, Ada R. Terry, Ada Emmy, Ada M. Story, Addison Proctor, Addison Center, Adelia Hartwell, and on and on. And of those days, perhaps nothing summarizes the days following, the days that are more in our times. Perhaps nothing summarizes this shrinkage more succinctly than this 2012 letter to the Gloucester Daily Times by Sam Novello. When I went to school, most of my kids in my first grade class's family worked in some part of the fishing industry. My family has been fishing in Gloucester since the 1920s, and at one time there were more than 100 of my relatives in some part of the fishing industry. Today, only 3 remain. What Joe Garland had begun to recognize well before his death was that conservation efforts to bring the industry back were being undermined by global warming. We know now that the rapidly rising temperature in the Gulf of Maine, warming faster than 99% of all other global waters, is making those conservation efforts nearly irrelevant, at least according to some scientists. I wonder what Joe would say about this headline from NASA's website: "Watery heat wave cooks the Gulf of Maine," or that butterfish and squid are moving in, not to mention green crabs, as we heard from Nubar's work. It's great if you haven't seen it. Moving out, on the brink of disappearing by one account, cod, with lobster possibly to follow at some point. Another headline: "Northern cod species face spawning habitat loss as global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees centigrade." And what would Joe say about Gloucester, along with so many other coastal communities, accepting the inevitable about sea level rise and choosing adaptation? What would Joe's response be to the City of Gloucester Coastal Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Plan, which warned that if no action is taken before 2030, that's in barely 10 years, Lanes Cove, the Causeway, Good Harbor Beach, the Backshore, Commercial Street, Rocky Neck Avenue, the Water Pollution Control Facility, pump stations at Thatcher Road, Good Harbor Senior Center, and on, including, quote, "most major evacuation routes from eastern Gloucester and Rockport could be impacted by flooding in the future." And it said, if these roads were significantly damaged by flooding, transportation of supplies, equipment, and personnel needed for disaster relief and recovery could also be impacted. And what would Joe say about this article in the Gloucester High newspaper, the Gillnetter? We heard from one of the Gillnetter writers earlier, which carried similar warnings. The Causeway and Mobil gas station flooded twice this winter. This caused significant damage to the roadways here, as people could not travel through that area of Gloucester during and even after the storm had concluded. Although it hasn't flooded yet, the sewage treatment plant's location there could pose severe problems in the future. If seawater floods the plant, it could carry waste into the surrounding area and contaminate anything that touches it. The footbridge at Good Harbor could be damaged again or swept away entirely. More flooding during astronomically high tides could submerge streets and buildings. I'm pretty sure of one thing Joe would say about this. "I'm so goddamn proud of these young people, these young Gloucester people." Willa Brosnihan and her friends. I have some idea what else Joe would say too. I think he would say, "People, get off your asses and do something. Save our town. And while you're at it, kick those climate-changing bastards out of office, denying bastards out of office." I mean, I'm pretty sure he would say that, right, Helen? Actually, we do know something a little more specific about what Joe would say because he said it. In Joe's 2008 speech on the inauguration of Carolyn Kirk to be the city's first female mayor, Joe spoke about, quote, the specter of global warming. A couple of feet or more of ocean rise sooner or later in the century alone, our beaches, among the greatest on the Atlantic coast, likely gone, and our salt marshes, breeding grounds for ocean fish, and what all else. In the end, Joe, though, I think, was nevertheless an optimist. Given where we are, it's harder to be one today, even than it was 8 years ago when Joe died. What would Joe say about the challenges today? I suspect, though his words might be tinged with more urgency, it wouldn't be too different than what he said when Mayor Kirk was inaugurated. Today we're at a very different, but perhaps quite as critical juncture in the 233rd year of our still struggling democracy, faced with absolutely urgent challenges to the heart and soul of our beloved and unique community here on the eastern shore of North America. Here on our unrivaled piece of the map, we can get it together. We can get together and get it together and pick up the challenges and regain our faltering togetherness and our pride, or be overrun by interests whose only interest is to exploit our place for their profit and our neglect, once more and perhaps for the final time, leaving us to pick up the scattered pieces after it's too late. But let's hear Joe in his own words one more time, from June 2000, as the movie version of The Perfect Storm was about to come out.
I'm far more concerned about the effect of modern times. I mean, I'm far more concerned about for one thing, of the tremendous wealth out there, the money that's coming into town. People are coming into town who've made their multi-millions, young people coming in, finding a fine old house, just tearing it down, no matter how great a house is, just tearing it down so that they can spend their money to build something new. I think we're going to weather this storm here in Gloucester. I mean, I know damn well we're going to weather this storm in Gloucester. We're going to weather the perfect storm.
Do you think Joe would still say that in September 2019, that we're going to weather the storm? I think he would. We can't know for sure. But one thing we do know, Joe Garland showed us all what a citizen is and what a citizen can be. That you put in the time, in the place you live, to be aware, keep your eyes open to make it better. Now, before finishing, I'd like to tell you one more story. I told you a little bit about the shell shock and PTSD and how Joe felt a kinship with the fishermen, that they reminded him of his buddies on the Anzio beachhead in Italy in World War II. But of course there was something else. Joe's conscience, his commitment, his vision, his sense of citizenship was ever and always sharpened by Helen, by our dear, dear Helen Garland. Now, on that first day that Joe and I met, when I finally switched off my tape recorder, it was starting to get dark. Old Joe, already after just a couple of hour interview, was now already my Gloucester mentor. He turned to me with one of those signature Joe Garland impish smiles, and he said, "Let me tell you about Helen." He kind of barked it at me, surrounded by this ticking grandfather clocks, watching as we did the blinking lights of the trawlers on the path to the open sea. In the Italy of World War II in Anzio, in what one military historian called a honeycomb of wet and muddy trenches, foxholes, and dugouts, an army buddy told Joe, you need a pen pal. And so he recommended his childhood neighbor from New Jersey, Helen Bryan. Joe wrote Helen nearly every day from Anzio. Helen, well, she wrote Joe back. By U.S. Army mail, they fell in love. In Joe's mind, with the smoke of battle all around him, they were going to get married right away, nearly the moment he touched on American soil. He had it all figured out, as long as he survived. And he survived. So on Thanksgiving, was Thanksgiving Day, Helen? Thanksgiving Day, 1945, Helen was waiting for Joe in pearls and a full-length fur coat at Grand Central Station. But she wasn't ready to marry, not just yet. Her father forbade it. First, she had to finish Sarah Lawrence College. With that small deviation in Joe's careful plan, crafted under fire, his perfectly created world collapsed. He was furious, dumbfounded. He cut off the relationship, burned Helen's letters. A writer who burns his beloved's letters. I mean, I'm thinking about it. Oh my God. As a writer, it's like a nightmare. It's the worst nightmare. He married another woman, raised a family, had 2 daughters, Peggy and Susan. Decades passed. Helen married too, had 4 children, Anna, Janet, Alison, and Rob. And then on July 5th, 1978, Joe, at work as he ever was, on his World War II Anzio memoir, Unknown Soldiers, decided he probably ought to contact Helen after all these years and see what she remembered, because after all, he had burned the letters. So they met again for lunch at the restaurant of the Thayer Hotel in West Point. And over that lunch, they fell in love again. 33 years after the end of the war. Joe looked at me in that fading light of his living room in the late afternoon at Black Bess 20 years ago. He told me he remembered driving back to Gloucester after that lunch in 1978. And on my way home, I pulled over to the side of the road and I cried my eyes out. But before long, Joe and Helen were married and living together at Black Bess on Eastern Point. So that's my favorite love story. Not an easy one, beautiful one. And you know, Joe finally published his memoir, Unknown Soldiers. It was the book he'd worked on the longest, by far, the one he'd had the most trouble with. It always felt to me that it was more of a trauma than a book, that Joe was working something out. Shortly after Joe died, I called Helen. We talked. She told me that after Unknown Soldiers came out, after he released it into the world, the PTSD began to dissolve. And if you think about that in itself could be traced to that fateful lunch at the Thayer Hotel in West Point in 1978. You saved my life, Joe told Helen near the end in 2011. You should have seen him. Helen recalled to me of Joe's final hours. You've never seen such a change in a person. Joe was in the living room, looking out at the passing ships in the harbor. It was magic, Helen told me. He was totally absorbed in something beautiful. Joe Garland, totally absorbed in something beautiful. Thank you.
Wow, Sandy Tolan, beautifully done. Thank you. Thanks again to all of you for coming. We hope all of you who are participating in tomorrow's panels and workshops have a wonderful time. It's been a privilege to share this event with all of you. Thank you all for coming.